Global thinking isn't just about ambition or hype. It's about not letting avoidable operational choices cost you the moment that matters the most. This episode of Innovators Inside features Noga Tal, an accidental techie who went from nonprofits to Microsoft and then into that messy intersection where corporates and startups try to work together and quite often fail. We're going to talk about why think big isn't just motivational fluff, but it's actually an engineering requirement. We'll talk about how you could sell your vision without making it sound like a parody. And we're going to dive into the AI gold rush, the noise, the speed war, and why Noga wants the human element to survive what's next. Welcome to Innovators Inside. Let's dive in.
Noga, how are you tonight?
I'm great. How are you doing? Glad to be here.
Yes, I am glad to have you here. Welcome to Innovators Inside.
Wonderful to be here. I know we've been trying to make this happen for a while, so this is super exciting.
I know we're recording in an evening in the summer. This is going to come out later, but we have been working on making this happen for a while. And I'm honestly, Noga, I'm just so pleased to have you on the pod. For folks that don't know her, Noga Tal is my friend, my former colleague, and a leader in startup ecosystem development, corporate innovation, and strategic partnerships, and just, has a wealth of really interesting stories and anecdotes. So I'm pretty thrilled that we're making this happen. Noga, just, introduce yourself to the audience. Like, tell us a little bit about how you came to be sitting on this podcast talking about this broad world of innovation and corporate innovation. It's kind of we all take a winding path to get here. What was yours?
Oh, 1,000%. So I'm the accidental techie. I had a completely different career path. And I felt I was working in nonprofits. I wanted to change the world. And then at some point I felt like I had reached a glass ceiling, so to speak. I'd done some really cool things. I'd been part of starting even a startup in that space, and I had the opportunity to move into Microsoft. I got a 7-month contract as a contractor, and I thought, this is cool. Let me just try it. Let me see what everybody's talking about. It sounded like this mysterious thing. All these people working in tech. And here I am 16 years later, 17 years later. I don't know. I can't even remember how many years it's been. So it's definitely been, it kind of was half intentional, half just, pure kismet. So I started out at Microsoft, actually doing different marketing projects and R&D centers and working with engineers. And quickly, I was really lucky, and I got this opportunity to be part of a team that started our very first ecosystem engagement with startups. Yeah. And granted, this is quite a few years ago, so Microsoft didn't even have a proper cloud offering in GA. It was insane. We were trying to sell something that was unsolvable.
An idea. Right? I mean, that honestly, that sounds a bit like a startup founder.
Yeah, it was very much like, who's willing to talk to us, who doesn't actively hate us, and is willing to hear about this crazy idea of Microsoft actually having its own cloud offering when everybody was already using AWS. So that's how I started. And then I just got all these different opportunities. I was really lucky to work with incredible people, and we were such a dynamic organization. I know it sounds a little strange, perhaps, for people who have a very specific view of what corporates are. But the startup organizations within Microsoft, and especially the one that we were a part of, were so dynamic that every year or two, I just got different opportunities to do different things and to manage different areas of the business. So that's how I got here. I came in, 7 months, and then all of a sudden you look back and, you've been working with startups for 15 years. So.
Well, and you've been featured in like pitch books, like All Raise All In, Women in the VC Ecosystem, right? You've been at the center of programs that bridge corporates and startups. So it is kind of you look around and you're all in, and there's probably a lot of stories along the way, I have to imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Oh no, just having known me for so many years, it sounds like you might have something.
No, I won't bring out all the stuff. No, I think, I want to ask about, something that I think I've heard you say over and over again. I think you believe really deeply, but it's this notion of kind of going big from day one, this notion of thinking about global scale. And
Yeah.
so, startups are usually driving some form of innovation, some form of thing where if they're going to be successful, they're going to be changing behaviors and outcomes for lots of people. Why? Tell me about that. Tell me about this ambition to think big from day one and why it matters.
So I think it matters. It matters for a few reasons, primarily because from day one, you're selling a vision. You're selling yourself and you haven't actually built anything just yet for the most part. You're going to VCs, you're going to accelerators, and you're selling everyone an idea. And if you want that to be a compelling story, you have to have a big vision. And I also think it just makes for very good planning. I've seen too many startups that, especially in smaller markets, where they have found a way to solve something and they know that they could solve it very easily in their own local market. The minute they succeed and the minute they have greater opportunities, they have not thought it through. And that's their downfall, right?
Yeah, tell me about that. Like they just get caught flat-footed and they can't adapt, or they have made irreversible decisions. Like
It's a bit of everything. I think it's the way that they built the product. Maybe they didn't build the product thinking about localization from day one. So they've built a product for their specific market, and they've made so many different decisions that are now, I wouldn't say reversible, but are going to require such an investment in order to adapt to a different market. It could be even just the simple things of like they haven't set up their HR systems and their payment systems in a way that they can actually go and hire someone in a new market because they've got this great opportunity
yeah,
tomorrow morning. They need to hire a salesperson in a different country. Guess what? They can't.
yeah, exactly.
Um,
Right up until some new startup comes in and
and
builds
swoops in and grabs,
builds the
grabs that
capability.
opportunity. And I think that tipping point of when opportunity comes to a startup is always very unexpected. It's really hard to tell when that's going to happen. You might think it's going to be much sooner than it is, and it might be just the opposite, where you think it's going to take you much longer, and then all of a sudden someone comes to you and with this great opportunity and it makes a lot of sense, and you just have not planned for it. So I don't think you should overinvest and plan for every opportunity in every market. But I do think you should have a strategic plan on who you're going after, who is your target market in order to launch your product, who's your go to market, but then who's your number two and number three, right?
Yeah.
You should also impress your investors and impress the accelerator programs you're trying to get into by showing that you have done your research and you do understand what's going on. I know when I sit on the Alchemist, panels and I listen to startups, it's the first thing I want to see. I want to see that they've done their homework and they've gone beyond how are they going to win in the first 6 to 12 months when they go to market. I want to see that they have really done their homework and they understand who's their number two, who's their number three.
I like this. I like this because I feel like you're hitting on some interesting points. But one of them is that, stated ambition, if you will, is a forcing function for doing homework on what it takes to achieve that ambition. And if you don't do those two things, you can build a cool business, you can maybe solve a problem for someone, but it's not going to, quote unquote, change the world, at least not immediately. And I don't know, I like that because I think there is something really distinctive between people who have asked themselves, is this a problem that some global audience or some broad diverse base of customers and individuals face, and do I want to solve it for all of them? I think that actually really separates people with the hunger and ambition to drive change in the world from people that are just kind of building a business, which is a wonderful thing in and of itself, but different.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree. I don't think that everybody should be changing I don't think every startup or every successful business has to change the world. I think you can be just as ambitious if all you're doing is looking to make some money. That's fine. And we do know that there's, startups will typically fall into two buckets. One is the ones that are looking to drive impact within a couple of years and then sell their company, cash out, go on to the next thing. And then there are the ones that see it more as a lifestyle. They're actually looking to build a sustainable business. And I would argue that in both cases, regardless of whether you're actually changing the world or not, you have to have a very clear understanding of what your potential is from day one and what you're leaving on the table by not actually looking at other opportunities from day one.
So how do you recommend that founders, and more broadly, I'm going to talk about innovators, bring people along when they're thinking big, right? How do they deal with objections like, oh, you're being pie in the sky? How do they socialize their vision, bring it along? What are some really actionable steps that folks can take to convey this?
Yeah, I think it always has to be about balance, right? When we think about the overly ambitious, I keep thinking about what was it? I think it was a Silicon Valley episode
Oh
where they were
dear.
making fun of kind of the repeat slogans that every startup
Mhm.
has. We're changing the world. Then when they get to the actual, what is it that they do? And it's like, oh, we help you to whatever tie your
Yep.
shoelaces or something ridiculous like that. So you don't want to go over the top. I think you always have to back yourself up with data. You have to show a clear vision of, here's the big vision and here's how we're going to get there. Here's step one, here's step two. And you have to show your audience why it's realistic and how you're going to get there.
Yeah.
Right. So it's really blending the kind of pie in the sky vision, excitement, and energy with actual data. I mean, the
Yeah.
best pitches I think you and I have seen are the ones that start with this great big vision, but then they really break it down for us and they explain why they are experts in their field, where they might have gaps, how they're going to bridge those gaps, and then what are those steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are going to help them to get to at least 50% success of that great big vision.
Well, I mean, it adds credibility, right? And like credibility derived from, call it expertise, research, data, planning. There's lots of ways to
Yep.
derive it, but that brings
Yep.
people along. I like that. Let's do something else. So, you've had a lot of your career at the intersection of large corporations and both, that you've been working for and partnered with and their innovation challenges and startups. There's a central thesis of it. If there's any central thesis of this podcast, it is
Yeah.
that large corporations need the innovation that exists in the startup community. And they just need to be thinking about change and innovation to stay relevant in a changing
Mhm.
world, but that it's hard. And so it's necessary and hard.
Yeah.
Tell me about this. Like, what have you seen and what have you learned about that intersection between the needs of large entities, whether it's a tech platform like Microsoft or one of the partners or customers, and what startups are trying to do?
So I think you hit the nail on the head. On the one hand, both sides desperately need each other, desperately. Corporates can't, they can, but they find it incredibly difficult to actually drive innovation and drive change. And they can't solve for everything. They can't solve for every scenario and every need that their customers have. So they absolutely need startups. Startups, on the other hand, of course, need corporates both for partnerships and for to sell to. But those relationships are extremely difficult. The matchmaking process is difficult. The success of the relationship is extremely difficult. So I'm with you on the optimism, but the reality is that most of those relationships actually do fail. So
Well, so and it's funny because like I remember really clearly, right, when I was back at Microsoft and I came in and I took over a role in the startups organization, our strategy and our thesis was so clear and so obviously brilliant, I think to us, right? It was like
yeah,
big companies, they're all customers of Microsoft, they're
yeah,
all struggling to stay competitive, they all need startups, we have them, we can make connections and magic will happen, right? I mean, it
yeah,
was a little more nuanced than that, but actually not that much. And then you start looking at the outcomes and you start seeing that, things aren't working. Connections get
yeah.
made, it falls apart, incentives are misaligned, whatever.
Lots of
Um,
lunches were had, but very few deals were made. Yeah.
Lots of lunches, very few deals, and you start to ask why. You're like, oh, everybody needs this. Like, what's going on? So, from your perspective, let's start with what's going on. Like, what are some of the lessons that we can take away about why it's so hard to build effective connections and collaborations between startups and corporations? And then maybe we'll get into some of what we can do about it. But why is it
Yeah.
hard?
So I think there's, first and foremost, a lot of times there's just a lack of alignment on the why, on the core
Mm.
reason why each side is coming to the table. And I see a lot of times some hesitance also from both sides to actually spell it out. What is it that they're looking to get out of the deal, out of the collaboration, the sale, whatever it might be.
Sure.
So if you're not being very upfront, both with yourself internally, with your other stakeholders, but also with the other side, it's just really hard to navigate. And you'll see a lot of times where there's all these unsaid expectations that come crumbling down as soon as there's an attempt to start to do something together. So maybe the startup is expecting a design partner, but the corporate is actually expecting the startup people to be able to deliver a very specific service from day one, for example.
Yep.
So I think that's one big piece of the puzzle. The second big piece is just inherent to the way that these two types of entities work, right? Corporates just have a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of oversight, tend to move very slowly around decision making, around implementation. Startups are, it's not just that they're hungry, they are in survival mode. They absolutely have to make things happen very, very quickly. So a lot of times there's a clash around that. I think it's also very difficult from the corporate side of the house or the large enterprises in terms of the definition of the problem itself.
Yes.
And the internal agreement, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you go into any corporate, just one division and ask them, what are your top 3 problems? You are going to get 50 different answers.
Yes.
Even if there are only 10 employees in that division, right?
Oh man, Noga, you're speaking my language. I have such a soapbox on this. I won't go on it, but yes, like how can you possibly solve a problem if you don't know what problem matters to solve?
And even if you maybe perhaps there's a decision maker and that particular decision maker decides to go in a specific direction, the reality is they don't necessarily have the support of different stakeholders beyond them. And then what happens is that entire experiment with the startup will survive for exactly a few months or maybe until the next fiscal, when that person is moved into a different role, when budgets are cut, whenever something happens to destabilize that person's decision-making power.
Yeah. Well, so I love this because you're hitting on some things that are kind of personal soapboxes for me, but they're also just like they're just not irreconcilably hard to solve, but they're challenging, right? Like one of them is the honesty. I love how you framed it as honesty, right? Because I think people get wrapped up in NDAs and secrecy and things like that, but we also get wrapped up in double talk and trying to speak to another party and what they think they want to hear, right? Especially on the corporate side, like just like as simple language, what are we trying to solve? Like honesty goes a long way toward success or failing fast. Either one is maybe a good thing.
Failing fast is a great goal to have.
It's a great goal. And then I do also love, I mean, the timelines are a little hard to deal with and the pace of change, but I also love this notion of you actually have to know and focus on a problem and know what matters to solve. So the hard question here is for people on either side of these relationships, innovators inside corporations trying to drive change, solve a problem, or startups who see the problem, know they have a solution, and are trying to get that opportunity to prove it. What advice do you have? How do you de-risk the conversation as much as possible?
Yeah. So first and foremost, be very honest with yourself. Sit down and build yourself a strategy paper. You don't have to share with the other side, but just be really clear with yourself and with everyone else within your company. When I say, it's easier for a startup than a corporate, but with a startup, you want to make sure that leadership and everyone who's going to be involved in the project is completely aligned with the goals and what you're trying to do. Ensure that you are properly resourcing this effort and that you understand exactly what your boundaries are. So if things start to go off rails and you need to invest more resources, are you actually willing to do that? What's that point where you're going to say, that's it's taking too much of our time and we're going to put a stop to it? I think from the corporate side of the house, it's very similar. It's being very honest about what it is that you're trying to achieve. What are the measurable outcomes? Ideally, you'd be able to set common goals and metrics between both sides and to have a very clear understanding of what the checkpoints are for each one of those metrics so that you do have that point in time, whether it's a month in, 3 months in, 6 months in, where you can take stock and say, okay, is this going? Do we need to pivot? Or do we need to say, do we need to stop?
Yeah.
And that's another one. Have an exit strategy ahead of time. Define what that looks like so that it's not a dramatic event that ruins the relationship, but it is something that is easy to talk about because it's been predefined.
So how do you fail with success? I love this because, we talk about like failing fast as being a positive outcome, although sometimes it's
Yeah.
hard to frame it that way. Have you seen examples of, I'd say failing with success, achieving that exit strategy, not having a bad taste in the mouth? And do you kind of know what the parties did to enable that?
1,000%. I think one is well, we just talked about it. It's really defining ahead of time what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And having each side of the house define that for themselves and to be very open and honest about it. If we don't hit X metrics, if we are not able to achieve integration within 6 months, we as Mr. Startup will have to pull out because we just won't have the resources to do that, for example.
Yep.
I think it's always good to also have other activities and other opportunities that you can continue to pursue as part of that relationship. So it's not an all or nothing, right?
Right.
Maybe you built the partnership around a few different areas. Maybe it's a data partnership coupled with a channel partnership coupled with some type of a marketing or awareness campaign, right? You don't have to throw everything out. If it's not working, you can still keep bits and pieces of it. I will say it also comes down to relationships. I mean, the more you have a personal relationship and that, level of trust and openness, I think that's become much harder these days with everybody working remote and, post COVID, et cetera, et cetera. But the more you can actually drive that relationship, the more there's a chance that you'll be able to sustain so quote unquote failure.
Yeah.
I can give you an example from something that I did.
Yeah, I'd love to hear. Tell us.
So I can't go into too many details, but I can give the kind of the broad strokes of this example. So I inherited a very large deal that Microsoft had committed to with a partner. And this was year 2 of 5-year partnership. There were, tens of millions of dollars on the table.
Yep.
And everything was, it was running along, but I could get a sense that no one was really happy. I started to dig deeper into what was going on, and there were multiple stakeholders inside Microsoft and then outside Microsoft. And the more I interviewed everybody, the more I understood that everybody had a completely different expectation of what the outcome should be. And none of those expectations aligned with the reality.
Amazing.
And even worse, sorry?
Oh, I was just like, amazing. Like, I can imagine this world. Yeah.
Exactly. We both know this happens quite a lot. And even worse, there was absolutely no way that the current agreement that had been signed and the money that had exchanged hands and the way that everything was set up, there was no way that it could actually be changed in a way that would solve for everybody's requirements. Just no way. So I had to do some digging and an assessment of what it would look like to actually pull out of this agreement, what it would look like to actually pivot and completely restructure this agreement. And as difficult as it was, I did manage to, through these interviews and through the listening to all of these different, people and leaders and understanding what they wanted to get out of it, I actually managed to come up with a plan that was 180 degrees from what we had been doing. But while it would fundamentally change the agreement of the partnership, it would actually potentially give everyone what it was that they were looking for. Now, it's very delicate. You have to go and then you have to sell that vision, just like any, startup that's pivoting. You have to go and then sell it to every single side anew, but it is possible.
Amazing. So I like that story, and I like the optimism that adapting is possible. Right? It's important. What's also really interesting to me that you talked about, and I almost feel dirty saying this, like, because it sounds a little slimy, but it's not. I actually think it's really important, is that with good relationships, you can find moments to celebrate in failure where everyone feels they can walk away with a win. And to me, that can be really important because it gives both parties the opportunity to go on to the next refined thing. Whether it's refining or revising a contract, working with a new partner or whatever, right? Startup can say, great, I had a design partner logo
Yep.
opportunity
Yep.
with a company, blah, 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 pivoted.
We learned a lot from it, whatever. Yeah. Exactly.
The corporation can say, hey, we're building a model for rapidly testing and integrating, and we got insight and we stayed ahead of the competition, or we got PR credit for supporting startups, whatever. And I think you can find these wins, but you have to be deliberate about looking for them, whether or not you have to pivot a massive contract. I don't know. I think there's something kind of interesting there.
I think what I found really interesting is the more you understand what motivates the person who's sitting in front of you, especially when you're working with a corporate, the easier it is to help them get to a win.
100%.
Are they how are you going to help them to look positive in front of their boss and their boss's boss? How can they go and sell the bad news that you need to deliver to them? How can they go and sell it as a win? If you can arm them with that story, then it should be fine.
Yeah, I love it. Make heroes out of the other parties. They're going to want to do what you want. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, so we know that this is hard, but can we look ahead to some of the trends that you're seeing and maybe prognosticate about an uncertain future? Like, what emerging trends are you seeing that might shape the way startups and corporates collaborate? And how should we prepare? And I'll give you one that's certainly on my mind, which is, I think, the emergence of this recognition of the importance for collaboration in different markets around the world. There's a lot of industries and a lot of different markets around the world, right? And I certainly think that, something you and I have talked about in the past is all of the uncertainty that executive leaders are facing more and more every year about how to react in the world. But like, stepping back, what do you see as trends that are impacting how startups and corporates are going to collaborate? What excites you? What worries you?
So I think to piggyback on the point that you were starting to make, as margins become smaller and competition becomes more fierce, I do think that a lot of the emerging markets are going to be much more pivotal in companies being able to succeed. So I'm very excited about that. I know you and I have both worked for different organizations and some of the same markets, and I have found it fascinating to discover an entire new world that I hadn't known before about innovation that is happening not in what we would call the top 20 ecosystems worldwide, but in ecosystems that perhaps are just starting to form.
Yeah.
And there's just so much incredible potential there, and it requires humility from many of us to understand that we just don't know, and there's a lot that we don't know, especially in these markets. And I think it also requires a lot of creativity. These ecosystems operate in a completely different way. They are so young and they are just starting out. And a lot of times the models that we try to come and institute on top of them, the kind of models we know from, Silicon Valley, New York and Tel Aviv, et cetera, they just don't work. They're not, they're so different, these countries
Yes.
and the types of industries that thrive there, that we need to, it allows us to really innovate how we do ecosystem work with startups and how we work on innovation. So that gets me very excited.
Well, can I build on that actually? Because I think I'm going to kind of violently agree with you and maybe tell you a little bit about some of my experiences here, because I don't know how it plays out, but we as alchemists do work in a number of, I'll call them emerging startup markets around the world. They're in some cases very mature markets, but whether it's, Tokyo, or whether it's the Gulf region in the Middle East, or whether it's, Midwest and East and Central United States, there's a really interesting common pattern that I've seen. And I'm often talking to folks in these markets about my home city, my hometown of Seattle, right? Which has a vibrant, and I would argue underappreciated, startup ecosystem, but it is a startup ecosystem that grew up entirely out of this cycle of big companies, your Starbucks, your Microsofts, your Boeings, your Amazons, your Coscos of the world, like having problems, people realizing they couldn't solve the problem in the company, going out, building a startup and then selling it right back to their former employer,
Yep.
making a mint, and then funding the next generation. And it was basically built and funded entirely by a challenge in corporate innovation. And when I look at it from that framework, I'm like, oh, okay, I see exactly that same thing. Both, it's both the potential of it happening, but it actually happening in Doha and Abu Dhabi, in Tokyo, in Memphis, in
Right.
Chicago. Maybe not in the same way,
Yeah, it's
but the
slightly different models. A lot of times the
same
government
forces.
will, yeah, in the Gulf, the government will probably take a stronger
Sure,
role than a
exactly.
corporate. But yeah, but it is very much the same impetus for driving innovation.
And so does that like what interests me about that is that I think that decentralizes the ability to build successful global scale innovation, because you have anchor, design customers and partners starting to emerge and pop up around the world. Is that a change, or is that something that's always been around and maybe is a little bit hidden to me?
I think it's probably a bit of both. If I reflect kind of my own knowledge of markets and ecosystems, it's one that, historically, especially as a US based company, we were just so focused on, Europe and the US that I'm not sure how much time we spent looking in other places. And then it's also just a maturing of these markets. Look at what happened in China over the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
At some point, they just get loud enough that we have to pay attention to them.
Yeah. And they whiplash their way through innovation and technology and all kinds of fun geopolitical ways we don't need to get into now. But yeah, okay. So I love that. So if you had one
But
piece
I want to go back to your primary question, because I think my answer is going to be a little boring, because we can't address the changes that I believe are going to be coming into partnerships and corporate and startup relationships in the next 2 to 5 years without talking about AI. I mean,
Right.
AI is going to drive these partnerships. And I think a few interesting things are happening right now. On the one hand, corporations are dealing with just massive amounts of data, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing, and they will need startups more and more in order to derive insights and to do something meaningful with that data.
Yes.
On the other hand, and we see this at Alchemist as well, there is so much noise in the ecosystem from startups around AI that it is incredibly difficult to cut through that noise and to understand who actually has a real tangible solution that is applicable. So I think right now, like a lot of areas that are impacted by AI, there's just a lot of chaos and a lot of noise. I think that's going to die down, but I think it's going to be up to startups to be able to differentiate themselves, 10x than they were before. They have to get so crisp in what it is that they're offering and what are they specifically able to solve for, and get really nitty gritty in the details of what that is. Because all of us have become cynical, right? We'll see 10 startups in a day and they're all talking about AI. And unless you can actually tell me what your solution does, that doesn't give me a lot of information.
And they're all talking about the exact same application of AI to the same problem. I think one of the things that AI has enabled, right, that you've seen and adds noise to the system, is it makes for a much more efficient launch stack, right? And between the business stack, the AI stack, like you can actually get to MVP and promise pretty quickly with a small team. And so a lot more people are able to get there, and all of a sudden you have more noise in the ecosystem. So how do you, as an entrepreneur, stand out and solve for the fact that there's probably 5, 10, or 50,000 people who do actually see and understand the same problem, and now they have the tools to go try and tackle it just the same way you do?
Yeah, I don't think there's 50. Yeah, there's usually at least a dozen that are doing the same thing. I think it's around messaging, positioning, and speed. I hate to add pressure to anyone who's listening to us who is a CEO of a company and they're already under intense amount of pressure, but I do see this happening more and more. If you don't move incredibly fast these days, you're just going to lose out. So I think it's being able to grab opportunities and to jump as quickly as you possibly can. I think it's about building trust. It's everything that we know to be true about startup and corporate relationships is going to continue to be true, but it's going to be 10x, 20x, even more so, right? So the
Well, and by the
element
way,
of it
that's
being
actually really important. I'm going to interrupt you. Like,
yeah,
yes, there's a lot changing in the world of AI, but there are some absolute fundamentals about the right of a team to be the one to solve the problem, the way to build relationships. Like, these are human things that don't change, really, right?
right, right. Being able to deliver on what you promise,
Yep.
being able to clearly articulate your value add, being able to ask the right questions of the corporate. Ideally, in the age of AI, and as AI matures more and more, corporates would be able to, clearly define what their needs are. Back to what we were talking about before, where we'll get 50 different answers about what the problem is within a corporation. I'm hopeful that within the next few years, corporates will actually have much clearer answers to that question because of their internal use of AI. I'm hopeful that will drive a better alignment with the type of startups that they actually engage with. But it also means that the startup has to be really clear about their value add and really clear about what they're able to deliver and how quickly they can deliver that.
Yeah. Makes total sense. Well, oh man, Noga, we've covered a lot of ground. This has been a really interesting conversation. We're coming up on time here, but let's keep looking forward. Not about what you're predicting, but what you want to happen. So, what would you like to see in your industry over the next 5 years? Are there, do we want broader access for innovators of all stripes? Do we want to support the female founder? Do you want to see a cultural change in adoption of technology? Like utopia for 5 years ago, at least professional utopia 5
Yeah,
years ago. What does it look like?
I would say yes, yes, and yes. I guess first and foremost, I want the human element to remain. And I feel like we're starting to lose that. I feel like the whole notion of letting go of people and instead of thinking how to redirect people's abilities and skills is something that troubles me quite a bit,
Yep.
especially on the corporate side of the house. I'm sure that the same is true for startups. I see startups, foregoing certain roles because they want to be more efficient, which is great. But I also see them sometimes foregoing certain roles that I think should still sit in the hands of human beings. So I think it's that distinction of where and how are we using AI, where and how do we still need humans? I know that's a massive question that is facing our entire industry and humanity at large. But I think for me, it's critical that we really keep that front and center when we talk about how both corporates and startups continue to evolve and to work together.
Well, I mean, okay, so this is where I get to be an optimist, but I actually have a strong soapbox take. I don't think it's a hot take, but you might tell me that it is. Like, I believe the world is actually heading exactly where you're saying. I genuinely believe that AI is giving experts superpowers. It is not replacing those experts, and it's not going to anytime soon. I mean, there are, and
I agree with you, but I think some people are not interpreting things that way
yeah,
and are not
I think
implementing things that way. And I think that I'm not worried about where it's going to land in 10 years' time. I'm worried about what's going to happen in the next 5 years as people read the map in different ways and implement it in a way that harms people's jobs, people's livelihoods, people's sense of self, people's sense of their future, their 401ks.
yeah.
I wish some leaders would take more care in the decision making processes that they implement.
Well, and I think that point that, at the end of the day, if you believe that humans are integral to the business, the customer base, the interactions with society, and everything that we do, making decisions that don't assume that they're going to continue to be integral you're probably going to shoot yourself in the foot. And maybe some people are doing that.
Correct.
All right. Well, let's be optimists. Let's hope that doesn't happen, because the world we want to live in is a world where AI has supercharged and made all of our lives better, not caused, a lot of downstream harm.
I don't think it will. I think it will. I think it will give us a lot more time to think and to play and to be creative and to create and to innovate.
Yeah.
I think the big question is how we get there. That's all.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what a wonderful note to end on. And I am going to ask you one more thing about the future.
Okay.
It's a little bit about the future. It's a little bit about today. Like, what's the last thing that you've just nerded out on and you're like, whoa, that's cool? Piece of tech, solution, whatever, that gives you hope for the future.
I'm going to go back to the same answer I gave you at the beginning because it just freaking got me so excited. The fact that I was able to diagnose something that had been, this happened to me literally this week. So something that I'd been carrying with my entire life, a medical situation that's not that serious, but it was always there. And I had always been researching it myself on Google and then arguing with doctors and not having enough tools to go and advocate for myself. The fact that I was able to use AI to get a solid answer and to advocate for myself and to get a proper diagnosis and to get proper treatment just is mind-blowing to me. Mind-blowing.
And it is so freaking cool.
And this is nothing. This is just me taking some blood tests and sticking them in Gemini, right? So I completely nerd out on the potential of AI for medical advancement, for cancer research, for just bringing data together and creating meaningful insights in the next few years that will just help to save lives.
Amazing. Well, Noga, thank you so much for joining us on Innovators Inside. This has been an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to the next conversation.
Thanks for having me.